Hi there, and welcome to Business Insights with Mr. Kerridge. I'm delighted today we're joined by Michael Coates today, who's going to share his expertise around the topic of lean manufacturing or lean thinking. So thanks, Michael. Thanks for giving your time. Really appreciate that. I know the students are going to benefit. So we'll kick off. We'll get straight into it. Can you provide the students, the audience, a little bit of background in terms of your experience and expertise and your current role?
Yeah, well, I'm Michael Coates, and I'm the Managing Director of a consultancy called Protostar Leadership Development based in the UK. As its name suggests, we predominantly develop managers and leaders of organizations, and a very common area that leaders want to be developed in is this notion of lean thinking. We'll be talking in a minute about the difference between lean thinking and lean manufacturing. But in other words, they want to be able to adopt many of the principles that organizations are using, and so I assist them with that. Prior to being a consultant, I was the HR director for an automotive company. I covered Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And that was where I was first introduced, in that instance, to lean manufacturing. And for the purposes of this today, I wanted to look something up. So I dusted off my thesis from my master's degree. I'm going to cover up the year because it embarrasses me. I was quite shocked as to how long ago it was, but there we go. So Kaizen, the effect of temporary empowerment on individuals and groups. And as we will be coming on to, Kaizen is one of the techniques used in lean manufacturing and lean thinking. And that was 1996. So I've been exposed to this for some time, either when I was working in manufacturing or now when I'm supporting organizations to work more effectively. So that's me.
Thanks for that, Michael. I think the students and the audience are very fortunate to have your time today. And this area where you've got expertise and you're doing it with real organisations, so they're really going to benefit from that practical application of what this actually means, what they're learning in the classroom. So in terms of kicking off and getting into lean, what do we actually mean by lean thinking? Is it just suited towards manufacturing? You've kind of alluded to maybe it's not, or we can go wider than that. And what are the 5 key principles associated with lean thinking?
Well, because I didn't mention that I also used to teach, so and I still am a visiting professor at a university out in Mexico, but I used to teach students aged 16 to 19. I do, of course, have a few slides to share, you know, so you can move away from teaching, but you can't take the teacher out of the person. So I'm going to answer your question with the use of a visual, if that's okay. Let's check that this works, of course. So let me get to the first slide. Are you able to see something that answers your question?
Yeah, that's perfect, Michael. Thank you.
Okay. Well, obviously your students can read very well, so the answer is there on the screen. But let me explain it in layman's terms. Lean thinking is a way of looking at any type of situation or any type of process or any type of product or service and trying to make sure that it adds what's called the optimum value. And value is a term that I'm going to talk a little bit more about when we get onto the principles. But it's also about making sure that whatever you do right first time, and that you do it efficiently. So for instance, if we ended up having to do this video 3 or 4 times to get it right, then we have not got it right first time. And that's taken up our time, that's taken up cost, and maybe we forgot something that we covered in the first video but forgot to say in the 3rd time. So lean thinking is not simply about manufacturing, it's about any situation where you want to add the best value you possibly can, get it right first time, and do it efficiently. And the reason lean manufacturing is typically used as a phrase is it was the manufacturing sector that took up this way of thinking, this philosophy, if you will, first in the 1950s, and therefore it became more associated with manufacturing. But increasingly, over the last, particularly over the last decade or so, the service sector has taken it up big time, because we all need to be able to do things in a more cost-effective, more efficient way that adds value to our customers. And you mentioned that there's 5 principles. There are indeed. And here they are. So the first one is that you need to be able to identify your customers and value. And I thought maybe the easiest way to explain that would be to talk about your school, or our school in general. So this is probably a debate you've even had as staff, but who are the customers? Is it the students, or is it their parents? And the students may well want something very different to what the parents want. I mean, hey, we were all students once. What we would probably love is for it to be a fun and a laugh all day, minimal effort, very little homework, not have to do exams, and come out with a certificate. You know, well, of course, their parents probably would be okay with that, but they don't want to pay large amounts of money. They probably don't want their kids at home all day. They probably want them there as many hours as possible. Who knows? So identifying who your customers are and what they see as the value you're adding is an essential step. Because if we take education, for instance, is the value a certificate, getting your IB at the end of 2 or 3 years? Is it getting a high grade? Is it that you're a rounded individual who has good values and a broad education and is physically fit and is a nice person? What is it that they actually want from your organization? So that's the first principle of lean thinking, is to make sure you've got the answers to those questions, because then everything else has to follow from there. At which point you then do a thing called mapping the value stream. So this is where in your organization does value get added. So again, let's think about a school. The most obvious place where value is added is with the people who teach. But the person who opens the gate in the morning, the person who keeps the place clean, the person who pays the bills, the person who feeds everybody, these are all adding value, but maybe they could be adding more value or different value. So for instance, the person who opens the security gate in the morning to let everybody in, they really have no choice but to do that, because otherwise students couldn't physically get into the school. So does it really add any value? No, it's just something that has to be done. But if they do it with a smile and they greet everybody, and parents know that gate will most definitely be locked once all the students are in and their children are safe and secure, then that's adding value. So what you do is you look at every aspect of your organization and identify where value is added, and if you're missing a trick and other value could be added. Then you do what most people are more familiar with, which is you look to eliminate waste, and we'll be talking a bit about waste, and create the most efficient way of doing what you do. And again, if you think about the education system globally, we typically teach one subject, then they have a break, and then they go and listen to another subject. They then get to the summer and have maybe 2 months off by which time students have often forgotten a lot of what they learnt at the end of the previous term. We just live with the fact that there's a certain amount of years that you have to learn at school. In the UK, a typical degree is 3 years, but in Mexico, where I also work, it's 5 years. So does that mean the 5-year one is inefficient, and the 3-year one is very efficient? Or does it mean that something is simply different? So even in education, there's not necessarily globally an effective flow, and there's probably a lot of waste. For instance, having to teach the same thing twice because people have forgotten it. And then the last ones are respond. So that's responding to customer pull. That would be the equivalent of, you already know that next year 10 students want to do the higher level biology module of the IB. And therefore you have a teacher who's qualified, all the equipment, all the syllabus ready, because you knew in advance that that's what they want. As opposed to, this is the subjects that we have, this is the resources we have, pick from them. In a supermarket, it would be the equivalent of, as you reach towards an empty shelf, a box of cornflakes appears because that's what you want. And they didn't need to have all the other cereals there. It just appeared as you needed it, which is clearly the most efficient way. So that's responding to customer pull. And then lastly, pursuing perfection, trying to get the highest quality and the best possible product or service possible. So there's your 5 principles.
Thank you for that, Michael. An excellent starting point in terms of just getting a feel for what this lean thinking is, moving away necessarily just from manufacturing, and this 5 principles in terms of the steps students can work through and trying to get understanding in terms of what is lean thinking and how do we approach it. Just taking a step back, just before we get into looking at waste, for example, can you just talk a little bit about the origins of lean? Where it actually comes from?
Well, like so many things, really, the Second World War was a big trigger. Particularly manufacturing around the world had to be more efficient. But in reality, although it got better, there was still a large amount of waste. They had the advantage they could just throw money at it, throw people at it. And there was a guy in the States, he was a statistician. I think I might have some details on him. William Denning. He was a statistician who tried to talk in America. He was American, so he was trying to talk to the manufacturing industries there, particularly the automotive industries, about his thoughts on how they could improve quality by measuring things and looking at it more statistically. And to be honest, they basically told him to go away. They were not interested in his views. Now, bearing in mind this was very soon after the end of World War II, he was then invited to Japan. So he was an American being invited to Japan, actually originally to help them with their census. But he then found a very receptive audience to his views on how measuring things, looking at things more critically, and his views on quality in particular was really taken up by organizations like Toyota, Fuji, Sony. And as we well know, over the next 20 years or so, the Japanese manufacturing industries really grasped that and became industrial leaders. Toyota in particular developed something called the Toyota Production System, TPS, and really it is the benchmark that nearly all the automotive companies have then copied, for want of a better word. So there will be a Ford production system, a Nissan production system, but they're all fundamentally based on the Toyota production system. which is why lean manufacturing gets mentioned often more than lean thinking, because they were the ones that really grasped it first. But essentially, Toyota were the leaders in this, and they basically took all of these principles that he was proposing and put them into an operating model, a method of working, and made sure that every single of their manufacturing facilities, wherever they were in the world, followed those principles. And therefore, you got the same quality, the same efficiency, the same lean way of working wherever they were. So basically triggered by World War II, and then this guy Deming, and then taken up by Japanese manufacturers. That's where it comes from.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael, in terms of giving us that foundation for lean thinking and how it's evolved into what it is today. So really, really useful that. Just wanted to touch on now, obviously, a key area our students look at when they're looking at lean thinking is obviously waste. What actually waste is. What are these non-value-add activities? What does that actually mean in practice? I know you've alluded to it in terms of the steps you mentioned at the beginning, in terms of the principles. Can we just explore that a little bit further? Because it's really, really a crucial point for the students.
Sure. Well, again, got a visual, as you might expect. When you talk about waste, I think, going back to manufacturing, I think the most obvious waste would be raw materials. So think of this in a kitchen, and you're making some cookies. You might, with a rolling pin, roll out, I don't know, some cookie mix or some pastry, and then you use a cutter, and you now have that round shape that you put in the oven. But all of the rest of the pastry that is left is generally just, well, thrown away. If you cook vegetables, you might have lots of it left over, which is thrown away. Well, the same is true in manufacturing. There is often raw materials that are simply not used or get damaged or get used incorrectly and therefore have to be thrown away. So the most obvious one would be the physical materials, often caused by a defect. So you'll see on the image there that the typical types of waste that an organization would look at would be every time you have a defect and you have to throw something away, that is waste, and waste is money. That's time and effort and the cost of buying those raw materials, and you've now just had to throw it into the bin. If you, again, went back to your baking scenario, if you bake 1,000 cookies, but there's only 4 people in your family, most of that's going to end up in the bin. So overproduction, making too much of what is needed, is also waste, because you're either going to have to throw it away if it's something with a short shelf life, or you're going to have to put it in a warehouse as inventory, and eventually it will sell. But that's money being held up in a warehouse that you also have to build and pay for. If you have to sit there waiting for something, and we've all done this, if you're waiting in a queue, that's time. So if you're paying somebody literally just to stand there waiting, that's a waste. If you have somebody with an immense talent, they're one of your students with their immense talent, and you're basically asking them to sweep up, well, then you are wasting their talent. If you're having to drive from A to B, but you decide the route is going to be A via D, via E, then over to F, then back to A again, and eventually going back to B, you're wasting fuel, you're wasting time. I've mentioned inventory already. Motion is a good one. If you think about in the kitchen again, let's say you're making a tea or a coffee. The kettle is often over in one corner of the kitchen. The tea bags and the coffee are often in a cupboard on another side. The cups are in a different cupboard. The sugar is somewhere else. The milk is in the fridge, which is over there. If you actually count how many physical steps you use when you are making a tea or a coffee, most of that is wasted. Why do we not have the kettle next to the fridge with the tea bags and the sugar and the coffee right next to the kettle, like they do in hotel rooms. That's a much more efficient way of doing it. Well, imagine that on an industrial scale. That's all wasted time and effort. And then extra processing is really where you've made the tea, for instance, but in order to get it exactly perfect, you wipe the side of the cup and you put a little flour on the top, and you know, that all that extra work to make it perfect. If you could have made it perfect in the first place, you wouldn't have to do it. So they are your typical types of waste.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. The visual is excellent, and thank you for talking us through the examples in terms of students understanding what is waste, what is muda. Really, really useful. So thank you for that. Just taking on a step, you mentioned right at the beginning, you said you've got the masters, and you mentioned about dissertation, Kaizen. Obviously, in the classroom, the students will learn about different lean methods or techniques used in practice, and some of the things will be Kaizen, just in time, Kanban. Some of these things. You know, in terms of you advising organisations and working with organisations, what are some of the lean methods or lean techniques that you use in practice?
Well, there's quite a wide range, to be honest. Going back through here, so the tools that we teach our clients, you can see on the screen there. That's just a selection of them. So I mentioned the value chain analysis already, but there's a wide variety of tools that are needed in order to act in a more lean manner. But you'll notice down towards the bottom left that I've highlighted one in particular called 5S. And that's an excellent starting point for an organization that's wanting to become more lean. Because if you simply teach them every single one of those, they have to have a mechanism for then using them. So they've learned all these techniques, but what am I supposed to do with this now? And also lean thinking it's a way of approaching work, and it can take months, if not years, to really ingrain into an organization. And quite often, organizations want to see quick results. So 5S, which I'm going to do a quick explanation of, is probably the quickest way of explaining these types of processes to an organization and for them to be able to see some results. And again, needless to say, this is a Japanese technique. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Japanese versions. They're on the left-hand side. I'm afraid I'm going to use the anglicized versions, which is sort, set in order, shine, standardize, and sustain. And basically you start, and you could do this at your home. And when I've taught this to high school students, we've set them as a project that they have to do a 5S project on their kitchen in their house, with their parents' permission, I might add. Interestingly, nearly all parents were well up for it, especially when they found out what it involved. And the first thing is remove all items from the workplace that are not immediately needed for work. So think about your bedroom, think about your classroom, think about your kitchen. I'm looking at my desk, which I'm glad you cannot see at the moment. I would say probably 60% of what I have on my desk really shouldn't be there. And some of it probably should be in the trash. So the first thing you do is you blitz your place where you work and you remove everything that is not immediately needed for work. Then you place the items, whether that be the people, the equipment, or the resources, in the most optimal position to help that person. So remember my example about the tea being next to the kettle and the sugar being there and the milk being there. You do the equivalent of that. And then this is another reason why parents love this project when I set it for the students. You clean the place totally. You really make it shine. And then you standardize work processes so that everybody makes the tea and the coffee in exactly the same way. And then you put in procedures to make this always happen. So let's say I instigated this, but I leave the organization. 5S should not die with me. It should carry on. So the way you start this is you go around your desk, you go around your factory, you go around your office, and you pick up anything which you don't think should be there, and you put a red tag on it, and you put everything into a red tag area. There's one there on the left. And people then have, the owners of those items have 2 weeks to come and claim them. But in order to claim them, they have to give a good, legitimate reason as to why they still need it and where they're intending to put it. And if they can't come up with a good reason, they can't think of anywhere to put it, or nobody comes to claim it, it goes to the trash. And when they come and complain 6 months later, where's my fan? I can see a fan there. Where's my blue box? You say, well, you haven't needed it for 6 months. So you obviously don't really need it. You had the chance. It's been chucked. All right. So you have this clear out, but you red tag everything. And so here you go. There's a typical sort of area in a factory. This is probably the packing area. And once you have removed everything, you tell them you have to find the optimal place to put everything to make it easy for you as the operator. So if we go back, here we've got packaging, we've got boxes, we've got rulers, and it's all in there somewhere, and there's no real space for anybody to do anything. By the time you've removed everything you don't need and you've put it down below the person, you can see there's his tape, there's the tape dispenser, there's spare rolls of paper, these are the boxes you use, and now it's on a roller deck like you have at the airport with your suitcases. So now once I've done my bit, I can roll it down to the next person. Anything big that I only use occasionally is close, but not in my way. So this is the second stage of 5S. And if you really want to see this in operation, go to a McDonald's. So this is a photograph from my local McDonald's. And basically the person would stand here to make them. And they have different boxes for the different types of burger. The items are being kept warm right in front of them. If they need cheese in a fridge, it's right next to their legs. They make it at waist height, and then they only have to slide it to the left in order for somebody who's going to pack it. If they're going to throw any trash, they literally just drop it because the bin is right next to their left hand. And it slides down here where all the relevant bags, all the condiments are ready to be weighted to be put in. So McDonald's is a great example of where 5S and lean production has been employed. But in a factory, I mentioned earlier about how inefficient we are when we walk from the kettle to the fridge and to the cupboard. You literally map, often with a pedometer, how far people walk when they manufacture something. And then you see why they had to move from point 1 to point 2. And you basically put points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 10 right next to each other, often in what's called a cell, a production cell. But this could be an administrative process. It doesn't necessarily have to be a production process. And now the person can stand in the middle there and do all 1 to 10 without having to do that. And then, you know, you open up every drawer, you look inside, and you basically make it much tidier and easier to find everything you need. So a very long answer to your question, but basically 5S is the process I tend to roll out in an organization first, because it gets the bulk of lean thinking or lean production in place, and then we can teach and utilize all the other techniques.
Thank you for that, Michael. It's really, really interesting because it's definitely going beyond what they've seen in a textbook and in terms of necessarily what they've got on the specification, and really getting to understand what this lean thinking is and how you're actually applying it within an organisation, how you really get a starting point for these organisations and the people you're working with really to think about lean and becoming more efficient. So, and obviously the examples you gave were very, very relatable. So thank you for that. Just one thing I wanted to mention at this point is when we look at lean and quality, this idea of variation comes up. Just wanted to touch on that. Maybe it's a little bit beyond the specification for the students at the minute, but in terms of variation and quality, why is this very, very important, and how do you look at this with organisations in terms of processes?
Yeah, variation is, well, once we've taught 5S, variation is probably the first thing we try to ingrain into people, that we don't want it. And it's not just me who says this. If we go back to William Deming, he said, if I could reduce my message to management to just a few words, I'd say it all has to do with reducing variation. So this isn't just Michael Coates saying this. This is the key thing. The enemy of lean is this notion of variation. And the way I teach it to people, by the way, and you can do this in your class, is you put a circle on the ground, let's say 1 meter wide, and you give your students a pack of cards, playing cards, and you ask them to throw them. They're probably standing, 60 centimeters in front of the circle, to throw them into the circle, and they have to all try and land as to the center of that circle, face up. And what you'll find is that some land face down, some are on the outside of the circle, some are literally outside the circle, and that is variation. Well, imagine that was a production process where those cards have to end dead center in that circle. Only the ones that landed there are of use. Everything else is a variation. And what we do with the students, or when I say students, I mean these are managers within organizations, is they quickly have a think about, how can I reduce down that variation? Well, one is get closer to the circle. Two, put my arm as close to the center as possible before I drop it. Make sure there's no wind. So they're trying to eliminate the causes of variation. And that's exactly what McDonald's have done with their process. So when they squeeze the mayonnaise, it's a set amount of mayonnaise that comes out. Everything is designed to make a Big Mac in Singapore be exactly the same as one in Newcastle in the UK, because all variation has been taken out. If you think about when you fly, the most stressful part of flying for me is when I get to the baggage carousel after the flight. Will my bag actually be there? And, if you fly as often as I do, regularly, it is not, because that is variation. Sometimes it arrives, sometimes it doesn't arrive. Sometimes it's sent to the wrong part of the world. Sometimes it's somewhere near you, but not close enough to give it to you. So if you can reduce or eliminate any variation, then that will help you. And the typical types of variation are people. So at your school, one teacher will teach differently to another, simply because of their personality, their style, their experience, their communication skills. Materials, they often differ in quality, in size. The method by which you do something particularly with manufacturing, if you don't give people set instructions, they'll find their own way of doing it. So again, going back to the kitchen example, one person might make an omelette completely differently to another person because they've learned their own way. But is it the best way? And the chances are one omelette is going to look very different to another omelette. The manner in which you measure what you're doing might vary, and therefore one person thinks they've done something perfectly, but another person is not that so happy because they're measuring it in a different way. And then just the whole environment in which people are working. If one McDonald's was completely and utterly different to another McDonald's, the chances are that the Big Mac would not appear the same. So these are the typical types of variation that you look for. But also, and this is rather pertinent at the moment, there are other things which happen over which you have relatively little control. For instance, if it rains, then what you're doing outdoors is likely to be different to when it's not raining. If the power goes off, then something is going to be different that day to when the power's on. And these slides were done well before the COVID situation. So it's a bit ironic that I'd put in there as an example of flu epidemic, but there we go. I was a predictor. So you get a flu epidemic and all of a sudden everything is being done differently to when there wasn't. So the top ones you have more control over and you would try to eliminate, and the bottom ones you often can't eliminate, but you need to have something in place to adapt a contingency, if you will, if those things were to happen. But the basic premise of lean thinking, other than those principles I mentioned, is try and eliminate as much variation as possible.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. Really, really useful in terms of taking the students beyond the curriculum and extending their understanding. So thank you for that. I think at this point, it's useful just to pause. Obviously, you've talked about the origins of lean and lean thinking. We've gone through these principles now. Okay, you've talked about waste and identifying muda. We've gone through some of the methods and tools that you use with organizations, some really, really good examples. So thank you for that. And then we've touched on this area around obviously variation, which you've linked back to this idea, rooted in lean thinking. So thank you for that. Just one thing I just want to mention at this point, in terms of the students' understanding, obviously we've gone through this, we've talked through lean thinking and maybe how you'd apply that with organisations or get managers in organisations to start to look at this. Why is it so important? Why are organisations wanting to do this? Why would you be advising organisations on lean thinking? Crucially, why is it so important for organisations?
Well, really, it all comes down to money and profit. At the end of the day, if you can do from your spare bedroom with one person and a laptop something that Google require 1,000 highly paid people and offices all over the world, who's going to make the more profit? So really, money has always been the driver here. And the reason why organizations have taken it is not simply so they earn more profit, it's just they realize that if they're not the first to do it, some innovative disruptor, as they're called, might come along from their spare bedroom and be able to suddenly compete with a multi-billion-pound business. Now, that means this is a very exciting time for your students, because there's nothing really to stop them from being the next Google or the next Microsoft, and I'm using IT examples there, but this could be the next McDonald's, this could be the next, well, any type of organization. If you come up with an innovative way of adding value that the current people are not adding, and finding a more efficient way of adding that value than the current providers are. This is exactly how organizations such as Uber, for instance, have decimated an industry that has been around since wheeled vehicles existed. This is why delivery companies are suddenly able to compete with the nationalized postal service. And this is why, of course, so many IT companies are coming along. So if we don't do it, somebody else might, is one driving force, but then earning more money and profit is the other driving force.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that, Michael. Just in terms of the students now grounding their understanding in terms of cost, profit, and that competitive position and the opportunities associated with that. So in terms of where we are now, I think we've covered off a lot of steps in terms of lean and some of the lean methodologies. So thank you for that. I think the takeaway now for the students is to have a go at your 5S challenge and see what they come up with. So I'll ask them to do that. So thank you for that. And obviously it gives them an opportunity to apply it to everyday life for them. So thank you. Just one thing I thought we'd finish on, obviously, given your position in your business, and obviously we're in the middle of hopefully coming to the back end of COVID situation, how has your business been impacted? Because, a lot of times students will be doing a bit of research and they'll look at businesses that have been negatively impacted. Yes, some have provided opportunities, but typically negative. What's been the impact for your business and how have you responded to the challenges and opportunities that COVID has presented?
Well, interestingly, we've done very well because we were already following lean principles. So we don't have an expensive office. So if you think about it, where everyone suddenly had to work from home, we were already home workers. So we were already doing everything online. Therefore, there was no real cost base that we had to pay for, even when initially in March 2020, a lot of our customers suddenly cancelled everything and we did get a bit worried, but that meant that our cost base was very low. But then customers started returning, including new ones, because they wanted management development, they wanted coaching, they wanted surveys done online because all of their staff were working online from home, and we were able to provide that very quickly. So actually, from our point of view, 2020 was a very good year. 2021 is looking to be an even better year. And when I think about friends of mine who are business owners, even ones who own cafes, and here in the UK, you've not been allowed to go physically into a cafe for some time, but they just started selling teas and coffees and snacks to people who are out walking, getting their exercise, just selling them through a window. And the margin, the profit on selling a takeaway tea and a sandwich is way higher than the meals they used to provide. They only need 2 members of staff. They're hardly using any electricity. They don't need to clean the cafe. So consequently, many of the people I know have done very well if they've been innovative enough and flexible enough and responded quickly enough to this changing situation. Those people who tried to keep their old business model going and just waited out until everything returns to normal, I'm afraid they're the ones who have suffered. But ones who are already lean or quickly adapted to lean and were innovative and responsive and flexible, in my experience, they've done quite well, and we are one of those organisations.
Thank you for that, Michael. Fantastic insight in terms of what COVID has meant for you as a business, some wider, examples based on the Northeast. So thank you for that. Really, really useful for the students to try and understand what opportunities or challenges it's presented for different businesses. So thank you for that. We won't take any more of time. Really, really appreciate it. I think the students and the wider audience are really, really lucky to have your input today on this, on an area where you've clearly got expertise and you're working with managers in real organisations. So thank you. Really, really appreciate it. And hopefully at some point we can come back to you and maybe there's another topic where you're consulting with businesses and we can look at that together.
Most definitely. Yeah, no problem at all. And, whilst it's not for me to tell you what your students should be looking at, but today we're looking at lean thinking, but other types of thinking are strategic thinking and innovative thinking, and they are all quite closely linked. So if everybody does get a bit of a taste for this, maybe they're topics that they might want to hear more about. But I'm more than open to helping anybody out on, within reason, any topic that you think might be being used out there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that, Michael. You've really stretched our students in terms of their understanding what they see in a textbook, taking that further, real world application. So really, really fortunate. And again, thank you for giving me time.
No problem.